So sitting with me are two very esteemed guests and speakers. They're two people that I know personally, that I very much look up to, that I will encourage everyone to look up as well when we're done. We first have Dr. Nadya. She's a writer and researcher currently working in policy and advocacy in the charity sector. Prior to this, she worked for over 10 years in higher education, researching, publishing, and teaching on the issues of security, borders, and race and racism. Also with us is William Barylo. He's a sociologist at the University of Warwick and a visual artist using film to speak about Muslim activism in Europe and how people build ways of resisting, healing, and flourishing. He's the author of Young Muslim Changemakers. So I'm really happy to have them both here. What I'm going to do, and ridiculously, I gave myself a daunting task of introducing just two concepts before I engage into a conversation with them. These two concepts are Islamophobia and neoliberalism. And it's daunting in the sense I'm going to try to do it in 5-10 minutes to describe these two complex phenomena, but they're really both of them quite simple, okay? So as for Islamophobia, I often, first of all, give the example. This is a real life example. Near the World Trade Center, there's a mosque there. That mosque has actually existed for a very, very long time. But following the World Trade Center, following 9/11, I think about 2008, 2009, they wanted to refurbish that mosque. Suddenly, the existence of that mosque created this moral panic, and people started swarming the streets, questioning why there's a mosque near Ground Zero. Protests are, demonstrations are happening, and there were these two Coptic Egyptians, who more or less might look like me, I'm Egyptian myself, who flew down to join the protest against the rebuilding of this mosque. Now, as irony and fate would have it, the moment that these two Egyptians joined the protest against the mosque, they were beaten up by the crowd, right? They were racialized as what? They were racialized as Muslims, even though it was completely irrelevant to how they identify themselves, right? So one way we can understand Islamophobia as a form of racism, which is very important for us to be able to maintain throughout this conversation, is that the process of racialization belongs to the spaces that we're in. We are racialized according to the spaces that we enter, right? And this is something that is also irrespective of how you identify yourself. Certainly already in the global north, what we're seeing in the UK and other countries, already being not white racializes you somewhere on the boundary of belonging, right? It's often that question that someone who's not white might be asked, well, where are you actually from, right? So there's an element of how racialization operates towards all non-white bodies. But for Muslims in particular, Muslims have a long-standing history of being racialized to threat, to regressiveness, to backwardness, to illiberalism. And I think significantly, for the purpose of our conversation today, they also have a history of being racialized as leeches on society that are benefiting from the welfare state. And so these are all the various ways that Muslims might be racialized, irrespective of how they actually behave or how they identify. And in the process of racialization, it's really important to maintain here as well, and I'll end the point on Islamophobia on this note. When COVID happened, I recall how there was a Turkish couple in Germany that was associated with developing the Pfizer vaccine. And they were being celebrated in the press, right? This Turkish couple that celebrated, that developed the Pfizer vaccine. And this idea of these ideal, Muslim, ideal racialized minority subjects who are benefiting the economy is contrasted very significantly with Germany's long-standing history of marginalizing the Turkish population and ghettoizing them and seeing them as leeches on society, right? And so we always remember there's this dichotomy between sort of celebrating minorities and seeing them as leeches. Now, as for neoliberalism, I think I'm still in time. Neoliberalism speaks to, very simply, to this doctrine, this philosophy of a global free market, right? I think there's elements of neoliberalism that I'm going to point out very quickly. One is this idea of deregulation, right? This idea that we want to leave everything to the market. Everything is an ethics of leaving everything to the market. Every element of our human interaction, of our spaces, to be decided by the market. And we see that with things like the NHS right now, where the NHS is increasingly being privatized, with the idea that the market can run the NHS better than if the state maintained control over it, right? There's also an element of deregulation that we see with Grenfell Tower. And I'm going to just quickly introduce Grenfell Tower just as an example. I think it's a really ideal example to bridge racism and neoliberalism. Now, one thing that was said about the Grenfell Tower was that it was caused by decades of deregulation, privatization, and prioritization of profit over safety. That's one thing that's very well recognized right now about the cladding, the incredibly flammable cladding that was literally infused within the estate of the Grenfell Tower. This has to be remembered with another fact that we know here in Britain. In tower blocks, you're much more likely to be a racialized minority when you live in the 4th floor or above, right? So the likelihood of you living in a tower block on the 4th floor or above, coupled with increasing deregulation and oversight, and leaving everything absolutely to market forces, which prioritize only one thing, and that's profit, has led to the incredibly racist outcome that we saw with the Grenfell Tower, okay? So I'm gonna end that point with a quote from a scholar. His name is Arun Kundeni, and he talks about the significance or the relationship of race and neoliberalism. I'm just gonna highlight a quote. He says that race serves as the means by which neoliberalism organizes and codes the boundaries between populations, between the exploitable and the unexploitable, the free and the unfree, and the deserving and undeserving. And all of this is very relevant to us when we want to consider what it means for healing in times of neoliberalism, especially for Muslim communities. And to this, I'd like to now open the conversation first with Nadya, whose work, your work has very much looked at the importance of inequality for Muslims. You've written so much on elements of austerity and how that's impacted Muslims. And I think maybe I'd just like to open up that conversation, maybe as an open question, if you could tell us about your work and how it's relevant to that theme.
Should I Hi everyone, thank you for coming on this grim evening after the clocks change. I always find that first week very weird. So as Tarek has said, a lot of my work has looked at thinking about the intersection between questions of race and then questions of state violence in relation to counterterrorism and things like PREVENT, but then also increasingly questions of political economy. So not just thinking about, for example, Islamophobia as it is made and sustained through state power. So for those of you who don't know what PREVENT is, I'm sure most of you do, it's a preemptive counterterrorism strategy, was introduced in 2006, but probably was around a bit longer than that. And it was just pathologizing Muslim communities as a source of radicalization. And the whole strategy was designed to preemptively spot who the radicals are, what the signs of radicalization are, and it was a way of basically embedding different kinds of surveillance within Muslim spaces. And then eventually it went from being kind of Muslim specific in a really explicit way. So early PREVENT, there's absolutely no interest or mention of right-wing terrorism or anything like that. It's all about Muslims. Is that when the strategy kind of is made to look more neutral, so it's concerned with all forms of extremism, what you get there then is basically, I think, more mass forms of surveillance and the embedding of PREVENT in the public sector, in the NHS, in schools and things like that. So at the beginning of my academic career, I was really interested in PREVENT and all the different ways in which it is called into basically govern and discipline Muslim populations in the UK, but also the ways in which PREVENT has really consolidated ideas of Britishness as whiteness. So we all know historically that to be British means to be white, and I think PREVENT is basically another iteration of that. And it's been really important, if you'll be hearing in the news a lot, politicians talking about Britishness and what it means to be British and all things like that. And PREVENT, even if you don't know about it or this is the first time you're hearing about it, I think a lot of those conversations wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't had PREVENT before that. So that was kind of one thing I was really interested in, I guess, quite early on in my career. And then later on, I became also then really interested in how Islamophobia, anti-Muslim racism, also is about political economy. So it's about how our society is organized. It's about resources, so who gets what and who doesn't get what, and the ways in which specifically, I think I became interested in this in the last kind of 5 years, was how Islamophobia has been really important to austerity and to justify austerity. And one of the ways Tarek mentioned was about the ways in which Muslims and racialized minorities more broadly are positioned as undeserving because they have too many children, they don't work enough, and all these different things. So I think once I started digging into that, it became really clear to me that actually we don't just need to be engaging with things like PREVENT, we also need to be engaging with projects of austerity as ways of taking away our rights and of positioning us, racialized minorities at large, as lesser citizens, lesser subjects, basically. And so one of the things that I did in my book, which came out this year, called The Violence of Britishness, was look at the relationship between immigration and the Windrush scandal, but we know it was more than a scandal, looking at that and looking at PREVENT. And specifically, I think what I became really interested in was then that relationship between Islamophobia and anti-black racism, and how the two are kind of made together, and how they affect Muslim populations and black populations at large. Because I think when we think about the question of healing, to me, the thing that became absolutely clear was that we're all in it together. So while the struggles might seem quite concrete and distinctive, our healing, our salvation lies with each other. It's not that there's one struggle here and either we do all the struggles or we don't do any of them. So part of the project was about that. And so, yeah, I think like recently I've been really interested in questions of cost of living, as it's called, and the ways in which not just austerity, but like COVID and the aftermath of COVID, the energy crisis has brought us to a place where racialized minorities and disabled people are seeing some really devastating outcomes, essentially, not just in terms of housing. Housing is obviously like a really important political issue at the moment, at which people of color are absolutely bearing the brunt. And I'm talking not just the detention of asylum seekers in really deathly conditions in Bibistock and other places, and in detention centres, but also the inability of people of colour to find decent housing. So people of colour are much more likely to live in overcrowded housing, they're much more likely to live in housing where there's disrepair, and as Tarek said, much more likely to be living in tower blocks above certain floors. So that's kind of one really huge issue, and then thinking about all the other ways in which, not just in terms of healthcare, education, increasing kind of repression, state repression. So I guess like what I tried to do really was to start joining the dots between different projects of state racial violence and the way that they are kind of initiated by neoliberalism, but also the way that us in this room and beyond have like a duty to each other to take up each other's struggles in a way. And it might feel like our struggles are not connected, but they are. Like, so I think that's kind of where the healing, or where, like, if I feel any optimism, that's where I feel the optimism. And then I guess, like, in terms of mental health, it's not my area of expertise, but I think also given what's been happening in the last few weeks, I'm like really grateful to Tarek for organizing this and for giving us space to talk today, because it's really hard at the moment to make space and to have conversation, but it's really important to do it, particularly when we're being told like we can't organize, we can't say certain things, we can't express solidarity in the face of genocidal violence. So yeah, like really grateful to Tarek that we get to be here this evening. So yeah, those are some thoughts. I don't know if I should say any more, but I felt like quite a lot.
I mean, you provoked a lot of thoughts, and I think in your writing you have a few examples, I think, of that element of like, that racism and inequality. I guess just like very quickly, it provoked in me the sudden realization, I think, during the pandemic, that like, inequality is really bad in Britain. You know, we saw very clearly how like racialized minorities were far more likely to suffer the brunt of the pandemic. And I think one of like the basic philosophies of neoliberalism is that, you know, people kind of deserve success, you know, based on like their work ethic and everything, but we clearly see that it's really only the rich that succeeded through the pandemic, that were able to protect themselves. Whereas through austerity, and I think that word, maybe I'll just quickly define, you know, it's this idea of like cutting public spending. So we give taxes, and the money that we give to the government isn't given back to us in terms of a social infrastructure that we can draw upon, which marginalized communities are most in need of, and that was completely lacking during the pandemic. I was wondering, I mean, I know from like from your work, you had like some stories. Is there like any stories that you feel that you can share about? I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you feel like the element of inequality has become quite magnified? Like we see it, especially among racialized Muslims. And I think there's a part here about Islamophobia. Like the Runnymede Trust has spoken about like I think it's called the religious penalty, or Islam. Sorry, the religion penalty. The Muslim penalty, right? Because if you have a Muslim name, you're far less likely to get hired, right? Like we think about how all these structures work together in terms of like marginalizing populations. So is there something there you feel like you can add to?
Yeah, so a lot of the ways that I tried to shift my thinking was, I did a project with my co-author a few years ago where we looked at people's lived experiences of Islamophobia. And one of the things that we found, particularly when we interviewed black Muslims, was that they were, and particularly black women, specifically often with children, is that people are positioned in such a way where they absolutely bear the total brunt of all these different intersecting systems of domination. So one of the things that we specifically found was like street violence was much more likely, and particularly where women would be with children. So they might be doing the school run, they might be going shopping, and they would be much more likely to be harassed and abused. And I think that was, I mean, like my own ignorance and naivety that I hadn't come to that before, but that really shifted then my way of thinking about Islamophobia and its relationships to anti-black racism and to anti-feminist politics as well, is that like actually the very presence of children of colour is like aggravating for some people. And we can connect this to the state's project of austerity, of like taking our taxes and not giving them back and not investing them and stealing them. So Carla calls it class theft. Is that basically like the two-child benefit cap. So there's a cap that only if you have 2 children, you can get child benefit and you can't get any more than that. And we know from the evidence that the cap has a really bad impact, particularly on racially minoritized families where there might be more children. But this doesn't change people's behavior. People have children because they want to have children. But what it means is that those children go without. They're more likely to be hungry. They're less likely to have school uniforms. It creates like more privation, basically. And the political class knows this. By absolutely, Labour at the last, a few weeks ago, had committed to removing the cap, and now is deciding, no, the cap stays. Even though it doesn't cost them that much money, they're going to keep the cap. And I think that's a really good, clear example of the intersection of that state project of austerity and of racism, essentially. And also not to forget, actually, Gypsy, Roma, Traveller communities as well, who also are badly impacted by that 2-child limit. So there's all these different ways in which, I know sometimes it feels like quite complicated, and it could be quite complicated to show, but that's actually a great example of, we know who benefits, we know who is suffering because that limit is there, we know it doesn't cost that much money, and yet kids are going hungry, and kids of colour specifically are going really hungry. So I think for me that the joining up of the struggles, that's that's a good place to look, actually, a good point of joint work, really. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's such a revealing comment, I think, just about how the system ends up also obviously discriminating against class, but there's a very significant sort of racialized component there.
Yeah. Which is often erased then in policy conversations, because policy is often done in a way that it's not meant to be like this. So there is a public sector equality duty. There are meant to be qualities impact assessment on every policy, but it's really clear where the harm falls. But that is an absolute, they know it and they do it, and that's why they do it.
Yeah. And I think also just beyond direct policy, I think we see it in the politics. I mean, I think when Nigel Farage was campaigning for Fortress Britain, and he was campaigning against migrants who are coming in. He wasn't standing in front of a poster of Scandinavians, right? He was standing in front of a poster of very, very obviously the racialized Middle Eastern, people coming in. And I think this idea of as you were saying, I think also from your book, this idea of who belongs to Britain, who doesn't belong, who's productive in Britain, who's not productive, and just how race plays a really significant role.
No, and I think without race, that politics would be much harder. And I think sometimes there is an argument made on the left, which is some variety of the state is doing bad things, and we're just using racism as a distraction or as a scapegoat, and that's not true. Racism is absolutely intrinsic to the cuts. It's intrinsic to who gets what and who doesn't get what. So yeah, so our engagement with it, or the ways of organizing against that, is that we need to take, it's that racism that we need to really contend with as the thing that foregrounds that violence of like, and this is why the literature on racial capitalism, which admittedly, like I've come to quite late, I guess, in my career, has been completely central to understanding like things that basically, you know, black Marxists were telling us like 100 years ago. Now it's just like, I know that literature is having a moment, but yeah, it's having a moment for a really good reason, which is that we need to grapple with the completely constitutive relationship between race and capitalism. And yeah, I kind of feel like I took a long way around to that, but yeah, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
I'm with you, by the way, taking a long way around to that. So I usually tell people, don't read anything I wrote before 2017. I think I want to come back to a point, but maybe in the second half of our session, I think about the element of inequality and the importance of healing. I think you were mentioning like really important points about like mental health there. But maybe I'd like to just like invite Will into this conversation now. William, thank you. I think you wanted to maybe like begin like with just like a personal story, like your personal, I guess your family's experience in neoliberalism, and I think maybe we can just like open that up, you know, very casually from there. Yeah.
Okay. Hello everyone. My name is William, and I am a child of neoliberalism. And I wanted to illustrate with my personal journey and the journey of my parents how, because with Nadya we've seen how austerity impacts materially people in like many, many different ways. But also I wanted to reflect on how it affects people by leading them to sacrifice parts of their culture and their core identity as well. So my parents left Poland in the 80s. And they were fleeing communism. And when I was born, they already had a very precise idea of what kind of jobs I should do. It was either a doctor, a banker, or a lawyer. They wanted me to get into these very high-earning jobs because for them, who came from with nothing, happiness was money. So fast forward a few years, I became a doctor, I earned my PhD, and I told my mom, look, Mom, I've got my PhD in sociology. She looked at me, very disappointed. You have become the wrong kind of doctor. So, okay, Mom. So, then, you know, when it comes to money, back in the days, my mom started to work as a cashier. And when my dad found a job, it was enough for my mom to stop working and take care of me and my sister until when I hit 15 and my dad lost his job. And since then became long-term unemployed. But then what were the consequences? Because he wanted to maintain the very same kind of lifestyle we had. You know, he was very happy, he signed a mortgage for the house, he bought his new Mercedes, and all of a sudden, he couldn't repay that. And he wanted to maintain, you know, the kind of same lifestyle. So what he did is he took on lots of loans. What he didn't know, it was variable interest loans. So you can guess what happened when the rates hiked up, he couldn't repay anything. And he put us all together in a huge, huge amount of debt. So we would do things like, you know, it's autumn, we would go and cycle in the woods, look for mushrooms and chestnuts. But one day it all stopped, not because we ran out of money, these things cost nothing, but because my dad, unable to find a job, he became depressed and he became an alcoholic. And what my mom had to do, she had to go back to her cashier job, working 7 days a week from 9 to 9, just to repay my dad's debt. But these are the financial implications, but there is something else that came even before that. When I was born, you may have noticed that my parents are Polish, but they didn't give me a Polish name. Why am I called William? They wanted to give me an international name because they knew that in this western part of Europe, there is a strong anti-Polish sentiment. And for me to get into these high-paying jobs, they wanted to put all the chances on my side, which meant they had to be very careful. And this is why they didn't even teach me Polish. I had to buy my own books And later in life, when I was like in my late teens, and asked my parents, please talk Polish to me. We used to go to church as kids, and it all stopped when I hit high school because my mom wanted me to focus on the grades. So, long story short, for the sake of me earning lots of money, they sacrificed my Polish heritage, my language, and my moral compass, which was religion. And ironically, a few years forward, when I embraced Islam, my mom told me, what are you doing with your Polish heritage? Yeah, that's mom. So, and when I was then doing my research with Muslims in France, in the UK, in Poland, in the US, I was very shocked to meet people with very, very similar stories. Like parents not teaching their kids the language, parents not giving their children very white-sounding names, and pushing them to do exactly what my parents wanted me to do: banker, doctor, engineer, and so on. So I just ask myself the question, what kind of society, what kind of system pushes people to erase their culture, their identity, and even their moral standards? Because, again, you know, it's when you're in a certain space, you cannot afford to be too religious or too political in a way. So what kind of society does that? And, well, if you open history books, this is exactly what was happening a few centuries ago during the colonization. Let's take, for example, France and colonial Algeria. They run campaigns for encouraging women to stop wearing the hijab. But what is happening here in the UK is not very different, unless because France does it by law, and you may have heard the latest debates, you know, about abayas and stuff. But the UK has a very different strategy, in the sense that when Islam becomes only, you know, a kind of a brand or a fashion statement, when the hijab, for example, loses all its meaning, this is exactly the same thing. Instead of doing this by law, you do it by culture, by social pressure. So where I want to go from there is that in Britain, if you want to be a valid citizen, you have to look a certain way. You have to speak a certain way. With a certain accent, you have to behave a certain way. You have to say certain things or not say certain things. For example, if we mention, let's say, Palestine, you may be at risk of losing your job, just like some very famous influencers lost their contract a few years ago. And this is why I think we can argue that neoliberalism is something very colonial by a sense. And even when you look at social media, a very simple question that I ask myself: why is everyone looking the same? Why, when it comes to popular figures, when it comes to women, it's all about makeup, lifestyle, travels. When it's men, it's all about food, cars, and the gym. Why is everyone doing the same thing? And why, so this, when it comes to religion, has become such a, like, you know, a brand, really, more than a framework, a philosophy, an ethical framework. It just, you know, it's this philosophy of stripping things out of their meaning, out of their essence, out of their roots. Because what happened, I'm trying to, you know, understand and look at history. When it came to, like, the times of Thatcher and Reagan in the US, what my parents believed is what they were saying, you know, that you can transcend the barriers of class, race, and gender if you become rich, famous, or powerful. That if you work hard enough, you can escape poverty, you can escape racism. But the thing they didn't tell us is that there is always strings attached. And if we look at even how it's phrased, you know, it sounds like, you know, things from a Bible, from a religion in its sense. This is why I call this a theology of liberation. But so, again, it all comes with strings attached. If you want to reach these goals of, you know, being rich, famous, or whatever, you have to fit in, you have to conform in a certain way, because we all know that when it comes to getting to these places, it's not about how hard you work. It's not about how skilled you are, how talented you are, how passionate you are about something. It's about who you know, which crowd do you fit in, and how do you fit in. This is where I'm getting at. And when it comes to then people adopting, you know, these kind of double lives, what happens? When you live a life for too long, people eventually break. And this is why you have reports, like the Muslim Youth Helpline a few years ago did a survey amongst a few thousands of young Muslims between 16 and 30, and 32% amongst them were having suicidal thoughts. 32%, that's 1 in 3 people, because of various reasons, because the social pressures, racism, and everything altogether. And the thing is, the society tells us, yes, we need to reach these goals. But what it does, it doesn't give us even the tools to heal, to resist, to think, just the time to stop and take a break and realize, hold on a second, what am I doing here? What is happening? We are not given the tools, whether it is at school, whether it is in madrasas, whether it is at uni, in the workplace. We are not given the tools to just, for people who come from challenged financial situation, to heal from financial trauma, to heal from bad parenting, for example, or to build a career strategy, to think about, different possibilities, to build the relationship skills with our parents, spouses, or parenting skills even. Who gives us that in the society? We may look for them on social media, but again, how do you make the difference between what is good and bad in all this sea of information in social media? And so we have people stuck in precarious jobs, stuck in bad marriages, bad relationships, struggle to raise their kids. But one question that always hit me is, if it has so much of negative consequences, why do people still believe in it? And then, I see how people are fed constantly all these narratives about that Muslim who became a politician, that Muslim who became a TV presenter, that Muslim who made it to Hollywood, or that Muslim who became a millionaire. Why don't we talk about, we mentioned, that Muslim who invented the vaccine, that Muslim who solved homelessness in their town, or that Muslim who, I don't know, who discovered some historical sites, because these are not cool stories. These are not Instagrammable. There's no profit, no status attached to it. But neoliberalism likes these exceptions and puts them as, role models and pedestals. And so everyone believes that, yeah, look, me too. I can build a business and make 6 figures. Me too, I can buy this Lamborghini because everyone on Instagram has it. Me too, I can get this 8-bedroom house. Not knowing that for one of these Muslim millionaires, there's probably 100 that ended up bankrupt or didn't have the right partners or the right investments or the right client base to start a business. And again, that's not a matter of skill or ideas or experience in some cases. This is, and you can generalize it, not only we're talking about Muslims, but it happens all over the board. It's because this country is a country of gatekeepers. If you don't have the right profile, you won't get the right networking opportunities, the right job opportunities, and so on, and so on, and so on. But who tells us that? And this is what happens when you put people who for generations have been deprived of financial stability, deprived of media visibility, deprived of political representation, and you serve this theology of liberation. And when people realize it's not possible, well, it breaks people's self-esteem. And this is, again, one of the hallmarks of colonization. What is the best way to control people? Is to make them believe that there's no other way out. And people become trapped. And people overcompensate. Because when you still want to show your family that you made it, that you're worth something, you want to have, feel around you visually, materially, that, yeah, you're not like, you're worth something. Not like what the media and the politician says. And this is why we see people falling into overconsumption, going on holidays, spending lots of money, like 100K weddings instead of investing, because these things are comforting. We have people who, just like my dad, had to take loans, credit cards, and mortgages to feel that, no, he is not failing in life with all the consequences it has. But unknowingly, because of all these kind of industry built around entertainment and consumerism, people, and because there is no information about what are the strategy to get out of this vicious circle, people just stay stuck in this kind of situation for an indefinite period of time. Because when people consume, they're not only losing the power to invest into something or whatever, they just lose autonomy. It's basically attaching. There's this analogy that I found on social media about neoliberalism. Instead of breaking people's chains, just painting them with a gold, like gold paints. It's a cage with golden bars in a way. And when for example, and even, problems like the problem of gangs. So I have a friend, his name is Mohammed Qasim, who's also an academic, and he grew up in Bradford among the gangs, and he did his PhD about gang culture and so on, and asked himself the question, why do people fall into this trap? And when he did his interviews with people in Bradford, he came to the conclusion that they feel they have a siege mentality. They feel in a state of siege because there's no way out. They feel locked out of society. And what happens when people feel locked out of society, deprived of any opportunities? Like anything can happen. Or like in the spectrum is wide. We're talking about prevent and all these like counter-extremism policies, which you may know offer lots of money for people to spy on like, their fellow Muslims. And this is how what happens, people who identify as Muslims but are happy to spit on the religion, spy on their peers, just because this is people who are desperate, in my opinion. And so neoliberalism, in a nutshell, it has done this amazing trick to turn people oppressed for generations into the oppressor in turn. And the reason why I'm sharing this story is just because, I don't want people to fall into the same traps my dad has fallen into. And as much as I wish that, he could tell us back in days, look guys, it's gonna be tough for a few years, and I wish he could have embarked on a healing journey and was aware of it, but he didn't even have the tools to know what was happening. Why was he making these choices? Why he didn't think more before doing that? And when was he clinging to that lifestyle? I mean, I understand with retrospective, but I really wish he knew. But I guess, in a way, on a positive note, this is why we're all gathered today, all together, to share knowledge, tips, and ideas that my dad or people who are in the same situation didn't have. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, William. I think that was a very beautiful and eloquent way of sort of tying your own history, your own experiences with, I think, just like the wider framework. I think that's something that, I think storytelling can be a very powerful way, I think, of revealing what neoliberalism is without having to intellectualize it. I think that was a really good example. I mean, you touched upon a lot of different themes. I feel like I can spend the next 2 hours talking to you about a lot of different things that you brought up, I think, that are really important. I just want to mention this idea of how neoliberalism sort of conditions us, conditions our way of thinking, our way of experiencing things, our way of experiencing relationships. I think actually to one thing, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, he has a really famous quote, which I really love, and maybe I'll just share. He says, we're no longer a community of people, we're a network of individuals, right? So we're no longer a community of people, we're a network of individuals. We know each other because we know each other through work, we know each other from, through all these different ways of the way relationships and networks are created, but we're not actually a community of people. And I think there's this element of how neoliberalism reconfigures so many things in our daily life. And you mentioned the idea of how sort of this erasure of, it has this element of erasure then, right? It erases things, it erases community, it erases history, culture, it makes everything a point of success, and we see that, especially in the Muslim community, we see that about the idea of respectability, it's called respectability politics, right? Like those who have the strongest voices are those who are most respectable, and those who are most respectable are defined by their success, that they are successful Muslims. How do you feel going forward, I think we're seeing quite a lot of Islamophobia right now, right? And I think the Islamophobia, especially what we're seeing, our heart breaks for what's happening in Palestine. And there's this demand of respectability, there's this demand of this erasure of community, this erasure of co-feeling, empathizing with others around the world. This idea, this really just suffocating idea, just focus on yourself, just go to work, don't think about what's happening abroad, just do your job, be successful. Maybe you can make a change eventually in your place of work, Is that something that you feel like resonates through that idea or that understanding of neoliberalism that you were talking about?
It's maybe just, it's back on, yeah, amazing. So yeah, I think completely, because first we're mentioning about individualism, and yeah, I think one of the symptoms which, not only of neoliberalism, but it's like since days of modernity, since the Industrial Revolution, there's this narrative of if you are in trouble, it's your duty to escape these troubles. It is, the narrative of the self-made man, self-made woman, which are complete fallacies, it's complete lies. Because if you look at the history of businesses, creativity, people never did things on their own. It's always a team of friends, a network behind the scene, but the media loves to serve it to us as, they made it by themselves. And there's nothing furthest from the truth. And so, and your last point about talking about certain things in the public space, or being too political in a way, I think what the dominant structures of the society fear the most is any kind of dissent, really, and it's been forever. And this is why, and they know that people who are at the margins are the more likely to say something against the policies and the kind of normal way of things going on. And this is why, this is what we observe with the erasure of cultures, the erasure of histories, the erasure of identity. It has a very specific purpose, because if you root yourself in nothing, then how can you contest? How can you contest things? If you were on your own as well, it's like compounding all of these factors. I'm not sure I can say more on that precise point, but yeah, that's in a nutshell, I would say.
No, thank you so much. I'm wondering actually how people are feeling. Should we take a small break? I'm seeing yeses. I think we only need one yes. I think one yes is sufficient. So how about we take a 10-minute break? Yeah, we're going to come back at 8:15. And then when we come back, we'll talk about why this matters for healing, for mental health, for all, everything else. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. I didn't really introduce myself in terms of my background profession. So I mentioned what my role is at Healing Justice London, but I'm also a clinical psychologist. And I teach and write a lot on the intersection of Islamophobia, politics, mental health. And I think a big part of what we wanted to build to, so we gave you a little bit of the sort of background on neoliberalism and why race and Islamophobia is really important in this conversation. But I think we really want to bridge it into discussions about healing, because I think we generally don't make that bridge very clear, and I think we need to start doing that. So I think, Nadya, one thing you were mentioning about just like, the racist processes of marginalization, there's a lot of statistics out there, right? We mentioned names. We know examples of this across the global north, particularly to Islamophobia, to Muslims in the job market. I'm just remembering right now one example of one employer in France that, you know, for a prospective employee, they would give him a cup of beer. And if the employee doesn't drink it, then they wouldn't hire him, right? So like that Muslim penalty is very, very clear in many instances, but is also very sort of implicit in others. So 2 quick points to that. I mean, I think in mental health studies, we know very much, there's something called epidemiology. So like just recognizing the demographics, the amount of mental health or mental illness that there is in society. And it's so well documented, the correlation between poverty and suffering and distress, right? And now you brought in that component of race. And I guess there's this weird tension, there's this weird dynamic here where people who, especially now that we're talking about Muslims and racialized minorities, who are impoverished, who are marginalized, are much more likely to be distressed, experience distress. You brought in the mother, let's say a mother who has more than 2 children. She's a racialized minority. She's now extra anxious. You know, she has less benefits to draw on. And so there's a tension of like, oh, do we address her anxiety, or do we actually recognize, you know, the actual circumstance, that her material circumstance, that she's not getting enough to be able to sustain herself? And what's my role as a therapist then to be able to like bandage that? Am I here to just help her succeed or overcome herself in times of marginalization? Like, can you maybe speak to that tension and what you feel?
Yeah, I think there's something really weird going on about how we talk about mental health at the moment and people's actual experience of austerity. So on the one hand, it might feel in a really superficial way that we're talking about mental health more than ever, and that there is like less stigma around it. And to me, the thing that I always think about when I think about this contradiction is the royal family, and specifically like Prince Harry, as like an advocate for mental health. And like, this is not to diminish his recent struggles either. I do feel a little bit sorry for him. But so there's that. So there's this thing we have where like, you know, and on your phone you can see like all these videos, or like, this is how I'm taking care of myself today, or these are 5 things you can do to like relax, or this discourse of self-care, and specifically self-care as something which, of course, we know where it comes from. It comes from Black feminists and the idea that self-care is warfare, and that to even exist in systems designed to basically like make your life unlivable, that's where it comes from. It's not about lighting a candle or having a nice blanket, although I enjoy both those things and I'm a big fan. But so there's that on one hand, this very like neoliberal, commodified version of your mental health and conversations about mental health. And then there's this like, and the fact that it's basically divorced from those material conditions in which people's mental health is produced. And one of the really good examples of how we can understand this is like, in the news, you'll see stories about mental health all the time. It's a really good angle, like press think of it as a good angle on stories, but never like thinking about, okay, so the parent who, you know, the single parent who, for example, like has to go to a food bank, why that might be causing distress. And the other reason why I find it really weird is we also live in a time of like accelerating ableist inequality, where particularly post-COVID, more and more people have long-term health conditions related to COVID, but also like associated with other things. So we're in a situation where on the one hand, there's a material crisis, but then we have this weird neoliberal discourse of mental health. And I think, I mean, again, like, yeah, I'm not the expert on this, but my, like, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm trying to say. I just think it's really weird, and it's not helpful. And that actually, like, being in a space like this is a really good reminder of the need to politicize those discourses about mental health and to put them where they belong, which is we live in structures that try to make our life unlivable in different ways. If you're a disabled person, you're a racially minoritized person, that's the problem. The problem isn't like, I don't know, you had a bad day, or you need some chill time from work, or you need some well-being time, or whatever. Because it's an industry in itself, right? So yeah, I just find it very, and as somebody who, like, I have my own mental health struggles, which I'm increasingly open about because I think that's really important. But I'm also really conscious that can only happen in this weird neoliberal space where it's okay to talk about your mental health. It's okay to say, like, you're having a bad week or something. But also, like, don't say you're having a bad week because what's happening in Palestine is really, like, making you feel you're watching death and destruction and genocidal violence. But also, like, you're here and you're trying to live your life. I was actually chatting with a colleague today, and she described it in such a beautiful way. She was like, there's something really uncanny about this moment. Where on the one hand, we're all coming to work and we're trying to, like, do stuff. But on the other hand, we keep walking past a television screen that's, like, constantly playing the news. And you're like, I don't know, trying to... The contradiction is, like, laid bare, basically. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the answers are. I think one of the answers surely has to be, like, a collective coming together in response to some of those things.
Thank you for that. I think that, especially that last point about sort of coming together and maybe sort of validating that we all might be feeling anxious about Palestine. We all might not have been able to focus on our work. And it's the political climate that's deeply pathological, that's deeply sick, that wants to force. I mean, I think in a way it also shows how much mental health is political, right? Like, the mental health systems won't recognize, you know, that people can be incredibly aggrieved or distressed by you know, an ongoing genocide that's happening, you know, at the exact same time. And I think that last point is really important, that I think we have to recognize that among ourselves. And I think maybe there's not enough spaces where we can come all together and say, we're feeling, you know, we're mourning, we're grieving. We also need to mobilize our strength and recognize, you know, how distressed we are in the moment. I think that's really a good point. And I should mention, I had like a roller coaster relationship with resilience. I think growing up, resilience was like my favorite word. Now I hate it. Every time someone says resilience, I kind of throw up a little bit in my mouth. I should say, I think resilience, you know, you were saying about like neoliberalism and resilience. We know, you know, resilience is such a powerful concept to like take away from public spending. Let's not have all these community infrastructures, all these different things to help people. Let's just make sure that people take care of themselves, right? And we saw that also in the pandemic. You know, people have to take care of themselves, take care of your own mental health, you know, and be resilient. But, you know, if you actually really need help, well, good luck, you know. And I think that's, those are really important points. I wanted to maybe shift to you, William. You mentioned, I think, a lot about, so I think you spoke a lot about sort of conditioning of subjectivity, or conditioning of our thinking, of our behavior, our relationships to everything, to ourselves, even the climate, the ecology, the environment, and how we become, I think, stuck almost like in this loop of like only one way of experiencing things, like experiencing happiness, for example. and you brought that in with the very powerful story of your father. I was going to bring in actually one of my first clients for therapy I had many years ago. It was a Muslim woman, and she really had a very hard time succeeding or focusing in her field of study, which was of hyper misogynistic. You know, it was a very difficult field of study. And she was feeling incredibly anxious to the point she was having panic attacks. And she was coming to me asking, I really need to succeed, right? I want you to just do whatever it is to make sure that I get to university, I pass, I become the best that I can be, right? And any sort of interrogation to like question that relationship with what success meant was it was difficult. There was a lot of sort of, you know, I guess there was a lot of resistance to that. So I'm wondering for you, if you can maybe just speak a little bit towards, I mean, you talk about this, you spoke about like this theology of liberation. What is healing? You know, what's the opposite of what this client needs or what we need? I mean, how do we rethink healing in a system where it's not only like an ideology, but materially happiness is kind of established around ideas of success. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, for that, again, I have a personal experience to share, because obviously part of my job is to look at Instagram and all social media to analyze what's going on and figure out the trends and everything. But it's not because it's my job that it doesn't affect me. And when it comes to success, I think that in the past years, there was a very certain idea of success that was expressed and spread through social media, particularly linked to masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? And so you may have, see this wave of influencers and stuff, like about the red pill stuff. What does it mean to be a successful man nowadays? And like the same old ideas, 6-figure salaries, Lamborghini, and everything. And so when back in the days I was using Instagram as well personally, so I was faced with this wall of images about, men in Lamborghinis, men at the gym, men, with like steroids, like arms and stuff. And then, there was also personal experiences before I got my job at uni where when I was looking for jobs, I would be for organizations and stuff, I would get rejected, and I would see like who gets hired instead of me. And I was wondering, is it a matter of skills? I don't have the right CV. No, it's people who didn't have the skills, who didn't have the CV or the experience. It's people who were loud, arrogant, and confident. Here we go. So, of course, when you see that wall of images, so you ask yourself questions. Am I valid as a man? Like, what am I doing here? Is it me being who I am, valid a way of existing? Why am I not attracted to these cars, to wealth, or why am I not very loud and arrogant and overconfident? Why don't I like Lamborghinis? Am I allowed to think that Lamborghinis are crap cars because they don't drive really well, they're just for show off? I don't know. But one good thing that I decided to do when my research project was over is to delete my Instagram, my Facebook, and not use social media, apart from maybe giving some updates to friends or just to spread my work, but without absorbing all these images, these buzzwords and stuff, because it eats your mind. This is what was happening to me. It's you doubt of about yourself, and it's really disturbing. So first thing is cut off social media. And all of a sudden, the noise it got silent in my mind. That was amazing. And then, it's also about what I did is setting boundaries with people who I didn't want to interact with because things they would say about me and or whatever the ideas they would have were more harmful than nurturing me. And because part of my life journey was trying to search for a community where I could belong to, and it was very fruitful until I realized that actually it doesn't have to be a group of people you find. It's something you build. It's not going to be appear out of magic, out of nowhere. This is something just the good people you find around you, just stick to them. Everything that nurtures you, take it. And whatever harms you, just stay away from it. Just like what we do with food, like if it's poisonous, we just like don't get it, don't buy it. And what else? And yeah, and also, not really related to that, but again to my job, is the state of burnout, where because we have obligations to pay the rent, the bills, the food, and so we need to work at some point. But the question is, what kind of environment are we going into? And being in academia, I went in with these like noble ideas. Yeah, I'm gonna make a difference for people. I'm gonna share knowledge, teach students, and all these like noble things. But when you realize what it is like working in academia, it's just horrendous. The work conditions are not healthy. It's not sustainable. People are being exploited, working twice the hours they signed for with half the salary they should. It's just horrendous. And so with my wife, we had discussions, what to do, because that it's not sustainable. If you don't have a life, if you cannot find the time to be there for your spouse, if you cannot find the time to even be there for yourself, so what is life then? What's the purpose of life? If it's just being in the rat race on the wheel. So one very difficult decisions we took is for me to be on unpaid leave at the moment after I finished my contract, my grant, and for me to focus on like healing, which meant first of all booking some therapy sessions and making changes in my routine, my sleep routine, trying to go to bed early, wake up early, eat healthy, stop eating comfort food, and do lots of exercise outdoors and see friends, as many friends as I could, the good ones, of course. And try just to recover and realize that, recenter myself. Because I think one thing we talk about, neoliberalism is something which is very, it tries to bring people to the centers of power, all these institutions why, humans are not homogeneous, society is not homogeneous. It's all about, what happens at the margins. And to quote Bell Hooks, something I really beautiful, she said is, the margins are actually the site of infinite possibilities. While, the center, all these centers of power want, dream of this homogeneous, uniform society and politically completely passive and stuff where it's this is not what life is. There's more to it. So yeah, journey is still going on, but it has tremendous effects, I can say.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think one thing especially worth highlighting and I think worth rehearsing for all of us, and it's a good reminder for myself, is I think neoliberalism essentially really just converts us to a market value, right? And then I just see myself as how much am I working? How much am I really contributing? And even I think right now what's going on in Palestine, I have a lot of people come to me and they're like, I'm feeling really anxious because they feel like they can't be productive. And it's interesting how we see ourselves constantly in this light of our ability to be productive. But one thing that I think is really key in what you were saying is surrounding ourselves with people who appreciate our value outside of that realm of productivity, and surrounding ourselves with that. And I think the idea of friends, I like how you put in I guess kind of like a footnote, good friends, because I think we can have a lot of friends who still, who might surround us still with that idea of, why aren't you working, or why don't you just get up and why don't you just focus, do what you have to do, but rather people who really love us and appreciate us for who we are and the value that we have, essentially, outside of anything that we do. I think that's a really good reminder in these times, yeah. So I'd like to maybe open up the space for questions from the audience, for our panelists. We have one in the back right there.
reproducing neoliberal values a lot in my own career. I'm doing a PhD now, and I would only be there if I'm the perfect neoliberal subject, which I am embodying completely. I track my productivity, I try to manage my time perfectly, I try to keep to the bright side of things, not to the extent where it would compromise my activism. Because I'm also a researcher in neoliberal ideology and subjectivity, because I truly believe it's screwing over all of us. And that's also what my data is saying. But so on one side, the neoliberal subjectivity helped me get to somewhere where I'm studying neoliberal subjectivity and how it screws over all of us full-time on a scholarship. But on the other side, I'm reproducing things, and like just my conduct is reproducing what is so detrimental to us. So that's one side. And on the other side, obviously, like my parents are super happy I'm doing a PhD, obviously, but there's at the same time this expectation that I'm still there for my community, which I can totally not manage. Like it's an unreasonable demand on my time to be that perfect neoliberal subject, be successful in my career, and at the same time be with my very community-minded family, which I'm definitely missing out on. And as I'm going towards my late 20s, I'm realizing this more and more that I'm quite disconnected from my cousins, my wider family, who are not where I am career-wise, but who have a lot more rich life when it comes to social cohesion. So yeah, I was just wondering how to escape this ubiquitous neoliberalism around us, because I feel like I can only make a difference if I am somewhere where people will hear me, and that means a lot of self-marketization, a lot of self-branding, a lot of commodification, because I need to live somewhere, I need to survive, I don't come from money, so I need to make it myself. So yeah, basically how do I escape this or balance things a bit better?
That's a golden question, right?
I can say something to this. So I was an academic till the end of 2021, and then I quit my academic job because basically like the tension between how unwell I was feeling and the job that I was doing was no longer sustainable. And so I was in a position where I had to either choose my health or my work, and I chose my health because without my health I couldn't do anything else. So I guess like when you're talking about balancing these things, there's and the contradictions between them, it's how far those contradictions are tenable, and if they are undermining or corroding something that feels really essential to you, then that is not a contradiction that will be sustainable. So there's lots of people, I think, in academia who succeed because they love it. They love the neoliberal machine, they love getting good grades, they love like winning, they love being the loudest voice in the room, all of that. And they will always succeed. And if you don't want to do that and you don't want to reproduce, I'm not saying everybody is like this, I'm saying the gatekeepers, the people with power and prestige are often like that. And you can have an academic career and not be that person, but you just have to accept that then you won't be the person whose voice is the loudest, who will get invited to all the things and give keynotes and whatever, all those markers of prestige. Like, you will have to make some decisions for yourself at some point. And you can make healthier decisions for yourself about like what's important. So, and just to kind of bring this back, so whenever I have a conversation with my mum, the main thing she always asks me is, Nadia, have you bought a house yet? And I was like, no, Mom, I have not bought a house. I'm probably never going to buy a house because I don't have enough money. And she's like, why don't you get a better paid job? And I'm just like, my job is actually reasonably paid, but in the context of life, there's just no way that I can do this. She's like, why not? And I was just like, well, these are the choices I've made. I'd rather have like less money and less stuff, but live a life where it accords with my values, which are actually, it took me a long time to work out what those were and why they were important to guide me in the life that I want to live. And even sometimes when I think, oh shit, my pension, how am I going to live when I retire? Where am I going to live? I try to remember that I've made choices that are real, authentic choices, and that serve me every day. Like, I don't feel bad about myself all the time in the way that I did when I was an academic. So, and when you're a PhD student, you're being disciplined into that system. That's exactly what you're being primed for. So but you have the power to decide on what terms you engage with this system. I chose to not engage with it anymore. I have friends who do their own calculations and their own deals with how they balance those things. But, you know, you can do that, but we can't have everything. Like, there are always trade-offs, I think.
William, do you have anything to say?
Doesn't work. It does. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just, I think it's the switch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, sorry. Just to bounce off, I don't know, Nadya, if this is something you've observed as well, but I've observed that in academia, those who succeed the most are those who care the less about their work, whether it's the students and the research. It's just crazy. So there's that. And what I was about to say, yeah, I think it's a lot to do with your intentions in the first place. What do you want to do with that PhD later on? For me, I know, for example, I went into a PhD because it was just, you know, the piece of paper to have, thinking that, yeah, people are going to listen to me. Doesn't work. And the other thing is about, you know, engaging in, you know, branding and marketing. This is something I have a real problem with, but because on the side, I have 2 businesses, I have freelance businesses, and I've realized that it works all across industries. The best way of branding yourself is not what people make you think, you know, to advertise your work here and there and pay money for ads or whatever in the framework of a business. It's actually the most solid growth is organic growth and marketing, who you meet, who you are friends with. Even at an event like a conference, if you meet one person, it can be that one person who's going to open the doors for you. It happens. It's rare, but it happens. We don't have, I think, to waste energy into, you know, developing this image because, well, this is a system wants to for us to do, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are always alternatives, and if you look at all the people who got to places in academia, it's always, you know, they happen to be friends with one person who was a gatekeeper, whether it is, you know, a commissioning editor, whether it was someone on a grant panel, and who told them how things work. And this is how they open the doors. So everything's possible, but again, I think it's as long as you set your boundaries and you check your intentions, yeah, that should be fine, hopefully.
Great, thank you both. Any more thoughts, reflections? Doesn't necessarily have to be a question. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for a brilliant panel. My questions aren't really well thought through, so forgive me. And there's slightly 2 questions in one. So many years ago, I studied globalization and development at a university, which I shan't name because they've been terrible recently. But, you know, we were taught lots about, like, in the post-Cold War, us living in a more sort of globalized, multilateral world where everyone can prosper, etc. And then it felt like there was almost like another wave of neoliberalism after that, just before the pandemic, with like hyper-individualism, consumerism, nationalism on the rise in terms of Brexit and things like that. But then social media, in a way, has like accelerated globalization. I guess my question might be a bit more for you, because I see it as like a double-edged sword. I do quite a lot of work with young people around mental health, and many of the young people who wouldn't use mainstream mental health services seek community online with one another in many ways. So, sorry, not my question. So in a way, so it's swinging us back to that sort of globalized state, but also because of social media, like we can see the atrocities that are happening around the world in places like Palestine, like we've never seen before, and we're able to sort of like challenge and organize around it. So I guess I just wanted your thoughts around the strengths and limitations you see around social media. How can it be used as like a force for good, and how can we rehearse freedom online as well?
I think the question of social media, it's very, very difficult. I don't think there's also like a right and wrong answer, because it's just so complex, and because, as you mentioned, the sea of information we have can be used for good, can be used for bad, but the more I reflect on the topic, and the more I think it's about the intentionality, or the intentions people have when they go into the platform, and the boundaries they can set for themselves. Because, for example, when it comes to what's happening in Palestine, I'm very conscious of the overload of information, and I'm very conscious, about not scrolling too much into the stories or the things I read, because it really affects me a lot. And it's about trying to take some distance. Ask me instead, of absorbing all this information, what actively are the things I can do, if I can do anything to make this my part when it comes to that situation. And I think it's the same when it comes to any kind of space on social media, any kind of information, about being very selective, being very boundaried, and very intentional about the things we go. It's just like, it is the analogy of a shopping mall. If we go inside it, it's almost, the scrolling mechanism is so vicious, as if we are almost forced to, in that shopping mall, to go into every single store and every single aisle before going out, which is completely nonsensical if we think about it. So, I mean, this is what personally works for me, is try to be boundaried, selective, and intentional, so I know if I'm going on social media, what's the reason for that, what am I doing, and so on, so it doesn't, I would say, take control over my mind.
I didn't really have anything to add to that.
Thank you, William. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions?
Question is, as individuals who immigrated recently, in our 20s, speaking for myself, here without my family, obviously I made a lot of friends, but I'm just thinking about the sentence you said, that we're living as a network of individuals rather than community. How do you move from being a network of individuals to building a community when everyone around you is people you've met within the last 4 or 5 years?
Me again.
I was just thinking. Yeah, I guess just thinking about what Will said before, is that I guess you almost have one of two options. One is to find something that already exists and to be part of that, and the other is to build your own community. And I think there's different challenges depending on who you are. So so my parents came here from Pakistan, and their community was basically the diaspora. So everyone who came from our village and from the wider area. And then our community was that as well, but also people we went to school with, kids our own age. But there was also a kind of gap, because that was all fairly self-contained, but then we also existed in a context where basically it was predominantly white, and then you could go and be part of that. But the thing that I always struggled with was to bridge those worlds. And I think, like, to be honest with you, I'm 40 in a couple of years, and the thing that I keep thinking about is I found a lot of my people in academia, you know, a lot of my closest friends, like feminist women of color, but that took me a really long time. And I'm still really conscious that I haven't found or been able to make, to some extent, I've been able to make the kind of community that I want. But I think it also takes time to like work out what it is that you're looking for and like what's important to you. And yeah, I'm still working on it. I don't think there's easy answers, but one thing is for sure to surround yourself with people who are like, you know, they're good people. They will always support you and take care of you. And I know I have that. But beyond that, yeah, it's maybe a bit trickier, which is not a satisfactory answer, but yeah. I don't know, Will, if you wanted to add anything.
No, I don't think I have a microphone. Three, testing. Okay. I don't have much things to add, but no, I think that's it really.
I mean, I think there's a part of an answer here, just to maybe encapsulate for both questions, I think, about social media as well as community. I think, and you had already said that, so I'm just repeating what you said. But I think there's an element of intentionality, right? I think just raising that awareness that that's something that we want. And then, you know, I think, because it's very easy to, as someone who's, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from London. You know, I've moved around quite a lot in my life. My family is spread around many different places in the world. And I think as I'm trying to raise my kids, is to recognize that community is not something that's just simply given to you, right? Community is something that we intend. We have to intend that community. You have to, you know, you search for it, and you find. We spoke about friends. There's a lot of different experiences to the sense of community, and we're hoping that this space is a rehearsal of that idea of community, right? Of coming together with like-minded people that eventually maybe you get to know each other's names, grab something to eat together. That's what community is, you know. And my mother, who passed away a long time ago, I'm very mindful that she was also, you know, she was a recent migrant in Canada. And I think we intellectualize so many things, but I feel like, and I've thought about this a lot, you know, she had this very simple understanding that food just brings people together, you know? Like, we're just like, oh, I'm gonna like, I gotta send emails to people, whatever, you know? And I think we can think a lot about what community is, but that sense of experience of just sitting with people, like-minded people, I mean, I don't think we have to over-intellectualize it, but we have to intend it. And I think that process of intention is not something where it's like, oh, I just reached it, but it's something like, it's a process, just like life itself is a process that we keep intending. And sooner or later, we're gonna meet people that we feel safe and secure around, that will give that sense of community, hopefully. I think it's the same thing with social media, by the way. Just this element of intention. You know, I think people don't intend to go on social media anymore. It's just like, oh, I'm on social media, you know, because they're just on their phone. So I think this element of intention is really good. So we are already near, if not at the end. I'm mindful of the time and respecting everyone's time, as well as the people who organize the space. So first of all, I just wanted to give a really profound thank you to both our speakers. If we can please thank them as well. Yeah, so I'm really appreciative of William and Nadya coming. I'm appreciative of people coming and sharing their experiences, their thoughts. Certainly, you can approach us as speakers, but also HJL is a fantastic community of people as well, and we have different resources and structures in place. That's what Rehearsing Freedom is about, is helping you find that sense of community as well. So just to let you know, there's more than just the room. And as we know, community is not something that is material, right? So hopefully what we're trying to rehearse is that immaterial element of it. There's a bunch of future events that are somewhat related to this, and I'm pretty dumb that I didn't write them all down, so the only ones I can really tell you are mine, which is pretty ridiculous. I apologize for that. But you could definitely get you can definitely see over, at the desk. You can grab yourself a program. On Thursday, I'm chairing another panel. That one's going to be offline only for all you online video game players that are watching right now. It's going to be offline only. You have to be in the space because we're going to talk about how we're going to talk about Islamophobia and suffocation around being able to mobilize on issues that matter to us, especially Palestine. So we're going to talk about that experience of anxiety and suffocation. That's going to be on Thursday at 7 p.m. And on Saturday at, I think it's at 1 p.m., myself and Suhaima Manzoor Khan are going to be in discussion about just this experience of being seen and unseen, what that means for healing, how we always engage in what we talk about respectability politics, you know, how people are invisibilized and revisibilized and why that matters, especially for Muslim mental health. So those are two future events. There's a survey right here. We'd love to encourage you to please just pull out your phones. If you ever have a second, you can just grab the survey right off this QR code, fill it in and let us know how you feel. And finally, it's exactly 9 o'clock on the dot, so I hope I get some credit on that. We're very grateful for all of you to be here with us. We're very appreciative of you to share the space with us. That being said, we must ask you to please leave as soon as you can. Besides some small connecting here and there, stuffing your pockets with snacks, we do have to clean up and get ready to go. So thank you all so much for coming, and have a wonderful evening.